Okay, today's writing tip is going to be pretty dense and go pretty fast. It covers a lot of ground, but it's all about one particular topic, blind spot. So you may want to be prepared to stop and pause and think about things, run it back a little bit. All stories are about psychology. They're a psychology of our problem-solving process. If you look at the characters in a story, each one has an individual psychology. So stories are partly about what happens within our own heads to try and understand how individuals make the decisions they do, why they behave as they do, how they grow, how they change. Similarly, we're looking at the ways that individuals relate with one another, how they come together in groups towards a common purpose, how two groups come together, or how a number of groups will come together in conflict and sometimes in cooperation. And these interrelationships among groups is important. The interrelationship among characters within a single group is important. And the function and mechanisms of what's going on in the mind of the individual is important. But at the heart of all that, the driver, the battery that makes it all go is something called blind spot. What is blind spot? Well, when Chris Huntley and I were first working with the Dramatica theory of story, before it even had a name, back some 25 years ago, we started asking questions. The main question that we asked that really had a lot of insight that came from it was, if a character such as Scrooge in A Christmas Carol is actually causing all the problems for everyone, how come he can't see it? How come there are characters in stories that can be the cause of the problem, but they can't see it at all? In fact, if you went up to him and you fully described how he was causing problems, he would have an alternate explanation for all those things, not because he's trying to dodge the issue or because he's trying to obfuscate the fact that he's the source of it all, but because in fact he actually doesn't see that he's the source of it all. Well, how does that happen? Well, there's some mechanism that winds up within ourselves that ultimately leads us to not be aware of something. Now, that doesn't have to mean that we're the problem and we're not aware of the problem all the time. It can be that we just don't look at things from a particular perspective, that we don't see a danger that's coming. Not that we're causing it, but that we don't see it. Blind spots can appear in your offense, in your defense. They can appear in your conscious mind as a whole, that you never think about something from a perspective. They can be a drive that's underneath your conscious mind that makes you attracted to something or want to achieve something, and you just feel you want it, almost like the instincts of a bird making a nest, but you don't know where it comes from. Blind spots are created all the time. Without blind spots, there's no drive. There's no reason to achieve a goal. Why? Because a blind spot comes from inequity. Inequity, when things are out of balance. Whenever things are out of balance within an individual, that's going to be potential between what is and what you might want it to be, or what was and what you'd like to return to, or the series of experiences that have twisted you up in such a way and then locked in position so that you have all this potential built up like a wound spring in a clock, and that's just sitting there to be applied to anything that happens. It's not that you have a particular goal or trying to get rid of something that is a consequence you're already suffering. It's that you just have this potential bound up within you. And that defines your personality, defines your psychology, defines who you are, what you like, the kinds of people you want to be with, what you want to achieve, whether you're a go-getter or you're a couch potato. All these things come from it. And why? Because if you look at the human mind as derived from narrative, the model that we found in Dramatica, you can see that the mind is a machine made of time. Every gear and pulley is a process, not an object. That the gears themselves are processes, and when they mesh, they engage in a process of processes. That's why it's so hard to see, that it all looks ethereal. Well, in fact, if you take the processes and treat them as objects, you can see like object-oriented programming. If you're familiar with computers, you can say that here's a process that does A, that's its function. So we're going to put that in our library, and every time we need to have process A happen, we'll just use that like a building block. We'll say we're going to put in that process, the same way you would with children's toys that have different components and they go together and do different things. Very, very easy, very, very simple to look at it that way. You objectify these processes. But in the mind that is neutral, all the processes fall in like a periodic table of elements in the mind. We call them in Dramatica a periodic table of story elements, because stories are about our minds, our passions, our logic, how the two come into conflict, and how individuals who are all have their own passions and logic come into conflict with each other because of the different ways they've been screwed up inside by life experience. For example, every time that you try to solve something by logic, you keep trying and trying and trying because maybe you have an affinity for it, because past experience logic was always great. And then all of a sudden, one time it's not working, and finally you have to reach the point where you say, maybe the point of the whole story, you can't rely on logic. In this case, you got to follow your heart. Okay, well, when that happens, suddenly you take logic, which is in the foreground, and you put it on the back burner and say, now I'm going to follow passion, at least in this particular area that we're working with, this particular context in which the story is dealing. Okay, so when you do that, you've made a twist from the neutral. Logic is no longer where it is in the process of a neutral mind, but circumstances have caused us to have to twist it around. And when we twist it around, then we put something else in the foreground. But we might also change the order in which things occur. Sometimes we're using the right pieces, but we're just not going about them in the right order, because time and space are what the mind is all about. A machine made of time, after all, made up of pieces which are in a particular relationship, which is our internal version of space. Remember, externally you find the dimensions of mass and energy and space and time. Inside you find the equivalents of knowledge and thought and ability and desire. No time to go into those right now, but you'll find them all over my website at storymind.com. But let's get back to blind spots. When you are mining something up by saying, well, let's try this, well, then you try feeling for a while. Feeling, and it's working now. And it works so much that you stop considering it. It becomes your modus operandi. It becomes your habit, to the point that you never consider putting logic first again. So you're stuck here with feeling, and now the situation changes in which feeling no longer works, and you can't understand why you're running into problems. That's how you end up with a blind spot where you are Scrooge and don't see that you're the problem. You responded to life the only way anyone in your situation could have responded to life. And by the time you've done it, you've created this blind spot that now is locking in place because you can't reconsider everything at the lowest foundational level of your understanding. Every time you try to make a decision, you have to say, no, I've seen this happen so many times, I'm going to rely that it always happens. And then you build on that, and you build on that, and you build on that. And then at the top, you're making your new decisions for every single moment that goes on. Well, when you're making those decisions at the top, what if it's not that this environment is a problem because it's not in line with its decision? What if some brick at the bottom of your pyramid of understanding is actually the one that's faulty and doesn't function in this scenario the way it's changed? Then you have a blind spot. Now, in other talks, we'll talk about how deeply you get in blind spots down to 4 levels. Why there's 4. Just as we have mass, energy, space, and time, and knowledge, thought, ability, and desire, we also have 4 levels of the mind. The conscious mind, memory, subconscious, and preconscious. And preconscious is at the bottom. That's where all of the things you do consciously, the experiences you have, become memory, and from memory they sort of average out into little snowdrifts of what attracts you and repels you in your subconscious. And from those snowdrifts, some of them turn to ice down at the bottom, and those little ice pieces down at the bottom become the preconscious, because not only is it filtering from your conscious down through memory and subconscious to the bottom, but once it gets there, it becomes a filter in front of your consciousness, so that where there's ice, you end up with a blind spot. Or you end up with something that's super enhanced, so you're more sensitive to it. Okay, I can go into a lot of examples about that. I'd love to, but we're 8 minutes in it, and I got a working day ahead of me with the new version of Storyweaver coming out that I'm working on right now, our step-by-step story development software. You can learn all about that and all about these other concepts of Dramatica on our website at storymind.com, and I'll be back soon with another writing tip focusing on the psychology of characters.